Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. If you were with us last day, you saw how Joseph was given by God the ability to interpret the dreams of two men who were in prison with him. And though one man received terrible news of his upcoming execution, the other man received news of his restoration into his high position in Pharaoh's household, and how Joseph had asked this man to remember him and bring his case to Pharaoh. But when the man was released and reinstated, he forgot all about Joseph, and how Joseph needed to trust God for God's promises in the face of a circumstance that seemed to be in total opposition to everything God had promised him. So let's continue now with the story in Genesis chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke. And behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So we discover, as we enter chapter 41, that 2 whole years had passed since Joseph interpreted those dreams in the prison. Joseph has been in prison, wrongly imprisoned, and now 2 whole years have passed. But then Pharaoh has a dream. And this is a significant dream that Pharaoh has. He has actually 2 dreams on the same night. In the first dream, he has a dream that 7 fat, plump cows come up out of the Nile River. The Nile River being the source of life for the agrarian community of Egypt. And he sees these 7 cows seemingly to come out of the river. And they look wonderful and healthy. But then following them, 7 more cows come up out of the river, and they look sickly and weak, except these 7 cows that come up out of the river, the sickly, weak ones, consume the healthy ones. They consume the healthy ones. Then he wakes up, and this is a troubling dream. And remember, as I said last day, about dreams that don't seem to fit regular life patterns. He eventually falls back to sleep, and then he has another dream. And in this dream, he sees this stalk, and it has 7 heads of wheat on it, and they're healthy, and they're large. But then he sees a second stalk with 7 heads of wheat on them that are dried out and sickly, destroyed by the wind. Except, again in the dream, somehow the sickly, weak, dead-looking stalks consume the healthy ones. So though they're different, yet it seems to be the pattern is the same. 7 followed by 7. The first 7 is good, the second 7 is horrible, and the second 7 overpowers and destroys the first 7. Pharaoh wakes in the morning after having these 2 dreams, and it's huge for him because he wants to know the meaning. He wants to know the meaning. And so he calls all the people in his court who should be in tune with the gods of Egypt, who should have understanding to be able to interpret the dream, but none of them can. And so here's Pharaoh, troubled by these dreams, but he's got this problem because nobody can interpret the dream. None of the people he would go to, his priests, his soothsayers, can interpret it. And then we have something happening here. Verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer, remember the chief cupbearer, the personal assistant, advisor to Pharaoh, says to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So suddenly, we have a remembrance. The cupbearer remembers. And we look at this and realize the significance of this now. When the cupbearer had been reinstated into his position, if he at some opportunity had spoken to Pharaoh, Pharaoh may have paid no attention. Oh, so you're telling me about a slave who's in prison. Who cares? What does that matter? That happens. But now, the most important thing in the king of Egypt's mind is being able to understand the meaning of these 2 significant dreams. And no one in his court can interpret these dreams. And suddenly, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Joseph can interpret dreams. Now, in this moment, Joseph's ability through God to explain dreams is of such great importance to the king of Egypt that he wants to hear from Joseph. Do you see the timing here? God's timing is perfect. We don't know all that God has been doing in Joseph's heart and mind over these 2 years, how God has been working. But at this moment, if there was ever a moment for the cupbearer to remember Joseph and to share Joseph's story with the king of Egypt, this is the moment when the king of Egypt most wants what Joseph seems to have the ability from God to be able to do. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And see, at this moment, when the time is right, God's timing is perfect, it happens, and it happens immediately. They immediately took him up out of the pit of that prison. They immediately cleaned him up. They immediately brought him before the king of the nation. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And we see here what Joseph is doing. Joseph, and we continue to see as his character is developing, Joseph immediately gives the credit to God. Though Joseph may be the mouthpiece, Joseph wants it known right from that moment that it is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God who is with Joseph, who is going to give Pharaoh what he needs to know. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed on reed grass. 7 other cows came after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. And then when they had eaten them, no one would have known they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as in the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for the land and the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." So we have the interpretation of the dreams, that the 7 years, the 7 number are years. And we are told there'll be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And unless they prepare for the famine, they will not survive it. And Joseph goes on to say that Pharaoh needs to take action, and he must find a man who can do this, who can save, who can reserve in order for the land to be spared. Verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the spirit of the gods?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, Bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So I want you to remember something. At this moment where we see God's plans being revealed, God's plans at work. Joseph, in a moment, has been taken from the prison, in a moment cleaned up, in a moment brought before Pharaoh. Pharaoh describes the dream. Joseph depends on God. God gives him the answer. God speaks the answer to Pharaoh, and in a moment he is promoted to the second most important office in the land. Joseph the prisoner, Joseph the slave, Joseph now officer of the king of Egypt. In a moment. But I want you to notice something here, because it's God's timing. Joseph was 17 when this journey began. We are now told that Joseph is 30. So for 13 years, Joseph was a slave and a prisoner. For 13 years, Joseph was a slave and a prisoner. Those years between 17 and 30, Joseph had to depend on the promise when the physical reality was far from it. Now, as Joseph is riding through Egypt, following Pharaoh in the second chariot, and he sees the people of the nation bowed a knee to him, and something in his mind likely is remembering the promises. When those would bow before him, he hasn't seen the full extent of his dream, but things have radically changed. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, prince of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Because Manasseh sounds like the word in Hebrew for to forget. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Because Ephraim sounds like the Hebrew word for fruitfulness. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the land. And we see God's word, God's promise, God's interpretation of the dream being carried out. Joseph now is the man in the position to save a nation and nations around him. Joseph now serves a purpose in God's bigger plan. But he had to wait on God's timing. He had to be patient in affliction and all that he has endured. And now he is seeing the beginnings of the purpose for what he endured. It is in the waiting that we wrestle most. When God begins to put the pieces together and we see them, or we look back and see how God has ordered our steps, we rejoice in him. And we need to often stop and look back and account for how God has ordered our steps. But we also need to recognize that in the moment there can be waiting. We need to hold to the promise. Hold to the promise in the midst of the afflictions of the moment, because his promises are true. Think about that. Meditate on that. Where are you in those years from 17 to 30? From being favored in your father's house to being lifted up out of the prison. Where are you? Trusting him. That at the right time, at the right moment, God will move you and accomplish his purposes in you. Because his plans never fail. He always accomplishes what he intends to accomplish. That is why we can take comfort in the passage we see in Philippians. It says that he who has begun a good work in us, every person who has accepted what Christ has accomplished on the cross for them, every person who's put their trust in Jesus Christ as their Savior, we know that he who has begun a good work in us will see it through to completion. Even if in the moment we feel that we're in the slave position, or maybe we have acted honorably in the consequences, we find ourselves in a prison of some making that's not ours. That he will complete the work he has begun in us. That's his promise. That's his promise. Thank you for joining us today. If this has blessed you, share it with someone else. And as always, thank you. And may God bless you.